This next video lecture of muscle tissue will include information about muscle metabolism. Metabolism is simply the sum of all cell processes, all of the chemical reactions that occur in the cell. Specifically here, when I'm talking about muscle metabolism, I'm looking at where do you gain the energy for those metabolic reactions. We're going to be looking at several different ways that the cell will gain ATP energy, but ATP energy is the only source that can be used directly for contraction activities. Some examples that we've already seen of where ATP is used include moving and detaching the cross bridges, so that cross bridge cycle. In order to move myosin back to the ATP, back to the ready position, you had to add ATP and hydrolyze the ATP. So moving the cross bridges required ATP hydrolysis. Detaching the cross bridges, the connection that you see between the myosin heads and the myosin binding sites on actin, detaching those requires the addition of ATP. So you use up lots of ATP during the contractile process. We also remember you store calcium within the sarcoplasmic reticulum. SR stands for sarcoplasmic reticulum. To actively capture that calcium, there are calcium ATPases. So these are known as calcium. Calcium is Ca2+, and they are ATPases, which means they are enzymes that will break apart ATP, but in doing that, they will actively transport calcium into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Another way that we need ATP is after excitation-contraction coupling. During excitation-contraction coupling, we saw an action potential spreading across the membrane. The action potential was due to the movement of ions across the membrane, but then we have to return the voltage across the membrane back to the resting state. And you remember, in the resting state, if we have a cell membrane, the inside of the cell membrane is more negative. Whoops, let me not do that. The inside of the cell membrane is more negative, and the outside is slightly more positive. So we have negative on the inside and positive on the inside. That gives us a voltage. For example, in many muscle cells, the resting membrane potential difference is going to be around 90 millivolts, but it's different for different cells. Okay, so that means, so it's negative 90 millivolts. It's 90 millivolts more negative on the inside compared to the outside. During the action potential, sodium, which is positively charged, so here you can see sodium is positively charged, it will move into the membrane, and that's going to change this voltage. This voltage is going to become less and less. It's going to be moved more towards zero, and so we call that depolarizing. So we depolarize the membrane. But now we have to, after excitation-contraction coupling, we have to move that back to the resting potential of 90 millivolts. And so we do that by the sodium, potassium, ATPase pump. This was a form of active transport. If you forget about the sodium potassium ATPase pump, I suggest that you go back to chapter 3 in your textbook and review it. It's a very important pump, and it helps establish the resting membrane potential difference. All right, So where are we going to get this ATP for contraction? Well, there might be a little bit of ATP left around in a cell after the last round of contraction, but that's going to be very small, and it's going to run out in as little as 4 to 6 seconds. All right. So we have to create more ATP. We have to regenerate more ATP. And in the muscle cell, there are 3 different ways that you can generate ATP energy. Either by direct phosphorylation of ADP using something called creatine phosphate. So that simply means the phosphorylation of ADP means that you take ADP and you add to that an inorganic phosphate, and that will yield ATP. Okay. So using the creatine phosphate system, we can directly add the phosphate ion onto ADP. That's very fast, but it's not going to last too long. So there's a couple of other ways that you can generate ATP energy. And we're going to go into these in a little more detail. The first is anaerobic respiration, or the anaerobic pathway. Now, the anaerobic pathway includes something called glycolysis, and glycolysis involves the breakdown of glucose. C6H12O6 is glucose. And we can break down glucose and get a little bit of energy out of it. If there is no oxygen available, then the breakdown products of that glucose are transformed into lactic acid, and that's released from the cell. And then finally, the best way is by aerobic respiration. And in aerobic respiration, you can completely break down the glucose into carbon dioxide. So eventually we're going to go all the way from glucose, C6H12O6, and it'll eventually be broken down all the way into carbon dioxide. Now, I know that chemical reaction is in no way balanced, but we break down glucose in the presence of oxygen. So over here we have to have oxygen into carbon dioxide. And this is a series of hydrolysis reactions, so we're also going to involve water as well. Okay, but this will occur, aerobic cellular respiration is the form that will occur in the mitochondria. So that's why mitochondria are so commonly found in muscle cells. All right, so first let's have a little look at direct phosphorylation. All right, so in direct phosphorylation, we take the molecule known as creatine phosphate, all right, and the creatine phosphate, the main job of creatine phosphate is to store that phosphate. It's an inorganic phosphate. So we keep lots of this phosphate around, and we take ADP. So we take our ADP, I don't know why I'm writing ADP again, but I am, and we break off that inorganic phosphate, and we can add those together. All right. There will be an enzyme that'll catalyze that reaction, and from that we can create a little bit of supply of ATP very quickly. This is a one-step process. Let me repeat that. This is a one-step process to create ATP energy, so that means that it is very, very fast. All right, very fast. So, doesn't need oxygen. We end up with 1 ATP per creatine phosphate, but the duration of energy is really slow, or I'm sorry, really small. You only get energy for about the first 15 seconds. So some of you may have heard of taking creatine as a nutrient supplement. And creatine does work as a nutrient supplement, but its main job in energy conversions is going to be powering this very fast, very short-term energy acquisition, the gaining of energy over a very short period of time. Then we go into the anaerobic pathway. And the anaerobic pathway, as I said before, takes glucose, C6H12O6, and breaks it apart. glucose is going to be broken down into two pyruvic acid molecules. And these pyruvic acid molecules are little 3-carbon molecules. 3-carbon, whoops, go back, 3-carbon molecules. All right, so glucose was a 6-carbon molecule, and it's going to get broken down into 3-carbon molecules. Now, if you have lots of oxygen available, those pyruvic acids can enter the mitochondria and you'll continue on with aerobic respiration. But if you don't have oxygen available, there is an alternate pathway that can occur. All right, so anaerobic pathway is actually used a lot of the time. All right, it's used a lot of the time. And that's because you need to get this ATP energy very quickly. And when you use really large, maximally contractile activities, then the constriction of the muscles themselves will compress blood vessels, and you have a problem getting oxygen delivery going to the large skeletal muscles. So you don't have enough oxygen available through the blood. In the process of this anaerobic pathway, the pyruvic acid will get converted to lactic acid. Pyruvic acid can't leave the cell, lactic acid can. And so it will continue to provide you a little bit of short-term energy. But this energy is only going to last maybe a maximum about 45 seconds. It's not going to last you very long. All right, so the lactic acid that is produced has the ability to go out into the bloodstream. And luckily, your body is incredibly efficient. There are other organs in your body that can use lactic acid as fuel. For example, the heart can use the lactic acid as fuel. So when you really start using your large skeletal muscles and you need to increase your cardiovascular output, the heart can take the lactic acid produced and convert it into fuel. Within those organs, you can convert it back into pyruvic acid and continue to use it for aerobic cellular respiration, or it could be converted back into glucose. All right, so anaerobic respiration doesn't give you a lot of ATP energy. All right, maybe only 5% as much as you get from aerobic respiration. You get about a net 2 ATP in anaerobic respiration. You can get upwards of 36 to 38 ATP if you go all the way through aerobic respiration. But it's very fast. The anaerobic pathway, which will include glycolysis, right? So remember, the anaerobic pathway will begin with glycolysis. Glycolysis is a 10-step chemical pathway, metabolic pathway. So there are 10 separate reactions, and that's actually fairly short compared to aerobic respiration. So here we see what could happen in the anaerobic pathway. You have to start with glucose in the anaerobic pathway, and that's another problem with anaerobic metabolism. You have to start with glucose. So you can either get it coming from the blood, or remember the glycosomes were little storage organelles inside muscle tissue for glycogen. So you can get the glycogen from inside the muscle cell itself. Inside the cytosol, we have most of the process of the anaerobic pathway. So glycolysis occurs out in the cytosol. You get a net gain of 2 ATP, producing pyruvic acid. If there's no oxygen available, then the pyruvic acid will get converted into lactic acid, and that gets released to the blood. So it still doesn't need oxygen. You produce 2 ATP per molecule of glucose. You also will end up with some lactic acid that gets released to the blood, but it's it's very short-term energy. It's not going to last you very long. Like I said, 45 seconds is the maximum, but you quickly, if you really are putting a demand on that muscle, you're going to run out of this ATP energy pretty quickly through the anaerobic pathway. What you need to move into, if you have muscle contraction that lasts really longer than 30 to 40 seconds, you need to be able to move into aerobic respiration. It produces 95% of the ATP during rest or during moderate exercise. The problem with the aerobic pathway is that it is slow. It's a very long series of chemical reactions, and these chemical reactions will require oxygen. The place that it requires the oxygen is actually the very last step, or one of the very last steps of the anaerobic pathway. The aerobic pathway occurs in the mitochondria. All right. You can start with glucose, and when you do start with glucose, it will break the glucose completely apart into carbon dioxides. So you get 6 carbon dioxides per molecule of glucose. You'll also generate a little bit of water and a lot, 36 to 38 ATP if you count all the ATP from the beginning of glycolysis all the way through the end of the aerobic pathway. So first your body will use up any stored glycogen, then it's going to move on and begin to use up any of the blood-borne glucose, begin to use pyruvic acid from the process of glycolysis. All right. You can also use fatty acids, so you can use things other than carbohydrates for energy when you use the aerobic pathway. You can even use amino acids for energy in the aerobic pathway. So the anaerobic pathway must start with glucose, maybe from the glycogen, but it must start with glucose. The aerobic pathway can use molecules other than carbohydrates for energy. So here's just a little breakdown of the aerobic pathway. You can see in this example we're actually beginning with glucose, breaking it down through the process of glycolysis into pyruvic acid. But now that you have oxygen available, the pyruvic acid can move into the mitochondria, and you can continue to break it down for energy. You give off carbon dioxide, water, and lots of ATP energy, so it would be 32 just from the aerobic portion. But you can use things other than the carbohydrates. You can use fatty acids and break them down. You can use amino acids for energy. So you can get energy from a lot of different places, and this provides energy for very long-term activities. So if you are participating in a sporting event that is an endurance event, then you're going to have to use aerobic respiration. All right. So this is going to be where the muscle can contract for a very long period of time, where you still have enough oxygen to power the aerobic pathway. Now, once you start increasing the intensity of the exercise, there's something known as the anaerobic threshold. As you begin to increase the intensity of the exercise, there will be a point where muscle metabolism will convert to anaerobic. Remember, anaerobic is very quick, right? And when you start having really intense muscle contraction, you may actually interfere with the ability of the blood vessels to deliver blood, to deliver oxygen. All right, so just a little side-by-side comparison of the type of reactions needed for short-term exercise and the type of reactions needed for endurance exercises. So within the first 6 seconds, your muscles will use up all the ATP that is stored. After that time, the muscles are going to have to turn to the creatine phosphate system and direct phosphorylation of the ADP. Then you start relying on the anaerobic pathway. So glycogen may get broken down into glucose. Glucose gets broken apart into pyruvic acids to generate ATP, and the pyruvic acids are converted into lactic acid. Right? But during prolonged or endurance exercise, you have to rely on aerobic cellular respiration. You have to decrease the intensity of the exercise to stay below that anaerobic threshold, to keep yourself in aerobic respiration. All right, now what can begin to happen? What can begin to go wrong with prolonged contraction? Well, we can get muscle fatigue. And as I said, an individual cell may fatigue fairly quickly, but the entire muscle cell should not fatigue very quickly. But muscle fatigue, the definition is the physiologic inability to contract even though it's being continually stimulated by a neuron. There's lots of things that may lead to muscle fatigue. Mainly, you could get muscle fatigue if you start off with some ionic imbalances, and then as you're continuing to move these ions across the membrane, that begins to interfere with your ability to couple the stimulation from the neuron with actual contraction. Or with prolonged exercise, you may interfere with the sarcoplasmic reticulum's ability to store and release calcium. It's only very rarely that you may actually run out of ATP energy because you have alternate mechanisms of getting ATP energy. Right? Sometimes when you do have a total lack of ATP energy, it may result in something called a contracture. That's where the muscle goes into a series of continuous contractions, and that can lead to a spasm or a muscle cramp. A spasm is when the muscle contracts greatly and you have a hard time allowing it to relax. And a cramp is when that spasm becomes very painful. Okay, so the muscle is contracting, but then it can't relax. Remember, you have to have adding more ATP into the muscle cell in order to detach myosin from actin, in order to detach that cross bridge. Now, after exercise, you will continue to need a higher amount of oxygen. And that is the oxygen required to return the muscle completely back to a resting state. Sometimes this is called oxygen debt or recovery oxygen uptake, although those two terms are slightly different. But you can think of this as oxygen debt. The muscle itself will store oxygen in the myoglobin. That has to be replenished. If you were using anaerobic respiration, and you probably started off with anaerobic respiration, then the lactic acid needs to be converted back to pyruvic acid. That requires oxygen. Glycogen stores have to be replaced. And finally, you have to resupply ATP and the creatine phosphate reserves. So you're ready to begin contraction again. So all of those require oxygen post-exercise. So after you finish exercising, your breathing rate does not automatically come back to the resting. You will continue to breathe a little harder and a little deeper slightly after finishing exercise. Also, what we've been talking about are lots of energy conversions. An energy conversion could be, for example, when you go from potential energy, so that would be energy that is stored, and the best example of potential energy would be glucose, C6H12, oops, that's H12O6. When you convert that potential energy into, let's say, mechanical or specifically kinetic energy. That's the energy of motion. So the energy actually involved in changing the size of the muscle. Okay. Whenever you have an energy conversion, you get a loss of what we call usable energy. All right. Most of that energy is going to be lost as heat energy, but your body is very efficient. 40% actually used as work. That's a very efficient machine. The remaining is going to be given off as heat So when you begin to exercise very strenuously, you could begin to build up some dangerous heat levels inside the body. So you will probably feel yourself radiating out heat a little bit more. You'll begin to sweat to try and get rid of that heat energy, and that's to keep yourself from building up too high of an internal body temperature. If your body temperature becomes too high, then you may have the danger of proteins, enzymes beginning to denature. And of course, when you are too cold, you'll begin to use those muscles to shiver to generate more heat. All right, so the next major topic we're going to talk about in the next video will be ways that you can control the force of muscle contraction. And we're going to look at all sorts of ways of the force of contraction and the speed of contraction. So we'll get to that in our next muscle tissue video.